Thank you. All right. So without further ado, I'd just like to welcome everyone to the Octo-Finals of Australs 2021. My name is Alia, and I'm going to be chairing for this round. Obviously, a massive congratulations to both teams for making it this far in the tournament. Let's just do some introduction for our panelists first, followed by the AF and NEG team in their respective speaking order. So panelists.
Hello, my name is Branko. My preferred pronouns are he or they. Good luck, everyone.
Hi, my name is Shudipto. I have no preferred pronouns. Good luck.
Affirmative team.
Hi, my name's Aisha. I'm the first in reply speaker and I use she, her pronouns.
Bella, she, her, speaking second. Harper, third, she or they, please.
Good luck, everyone.
Yep, and negative.
Hi, negative here. Speaking first, Ryosuke, he, him. Speaking second and also reply, Tota, he, him. And Kanan would be speaking third, she, her. Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Would like to specify that my pronouns are she, they. I'm going to be clapping once at 6 minutes, twice at 8 minutes, and 3 times at 8 minutes 15 seconds. I obviously highly recommend that you time yourselves as well. But without further ado, let's get into the debate, and I'd like to invite the first affirmative to open the debate here.
Sweet. Am I audible and visible?
Yep, both.
I'm going to give some trigger warnings to start my speech, that there's going to be mentions of COVID-19 and deaths associated with that. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to intro this debate with what the coverage looks like in the status quo and what the counterfactual is likely to be. Note, this is all analysis done in my introduction. The coverage in the status quo looks like very attacking, quite confrontational depictions of these people's deaths. The analysis, the coverage isn't rest in peace, this person was taken so soon and we are very upset they died. The tone is more, they got what was coming to them, they deserved this because they did not get a vaccination, because A, media has become more partisan and it becomes clickbaity and popular to your readers to shit on the other side, but B, there's heightened emotions about an issue which has been going on for 2 years, is incredibly emotional, straining to people who have known people who've died from COVID, who know people who won't take vaccinations. It's a very heightened media issue, which leads to increasing sensational and shocking tones. We would prefer a counterfactual where you focus on the statistics of the unvaccinated people, statistics of people dying and how many of those are vaccinated. We think that is the most likely thing to rise up in its place. Firstly, because left-wing media obviously continues to want to increase vaccination rates, obviously continues to want to push the agenda of being able to get more people vaccinations. So if they don't report on the deaths of these prominent anti-vaxxers, they're instead likely to do something that is still in the interest of people when the majority of people are interested in COVID, and that probably looks like statistics of like people who have died. That's the next thing that they are able to report on if they cannot report on these people's deaths, because people are interested in COVID and cares specifically about the statistics and those case numbers. People tune into case numbers relentlessly. We think they'll tune into statistics as well. 2 points in this debate. Firstly, on why this is principally abhorrent to do, and secondly, on which side most effectively counters A, the people who are anti-vax, and B, people who are on the fence / hesitant. Firstly, on principally abhorrent. This is top level analysis in this debate, which means regardless of any practical claims the negating team might make, this should win us the debate alone. It shouldn't be done because it is principally abhorrent. 3 ways in which it is principally abhorrent. The first is to say that it is detrimental to this individual's family, Death is an incredibly emotionally impactful thing, and grief is incredibly hard for people to deal with. It is hard to process, it is sudden, and it is final. We note that this is especially worse with deaths that occur due to COVID-19. In your final days, you cannot breathe, and it feels like you are choking. So if you Zoom your family, they are watching you choke on your own, choke because you cannot get air into your lungs. Your family can't visit you in hospital and can never engage with you to properly say goodbye face to face, and they can't have a big funeral with your whole family there, often due to COVID restrictions in a lot of countries. But also it is a quite sudden and rapid progression. If you think of Delta, the time rate from like onset to death can be up like 2 weeks. That is incredibly sudden to accept that your family member is going to die and you will never see them ever again. This makes it even harder. And is it abhorrent to do this to families who have done nothing wrong, are not prominent anti-vax people, and have not consented to their families to their family members being shit on in the media when they're trying to process an incredibly harmful impact of grief. The second, we think it is disgusting that left-wing media would publicly shame these people, would publicly say they deserved what they got, when news articles on how horrific they are, deserve to die, get floated around everywhere, and these people's families and grief suffers as a whole. The comments which are made about these people materially affect these families, and that harms them in irrevocable ways. Think about how media organizations do not comment on how people commit suicide. We think it is similar that they should not comment on how people die of COVID-19. We think they are similar harms to the grief of family and therefore shouldn't be done. But we tell you this principle wrong is only compounded by the fact that many people who are anti-vax and are prominent anti-vax activists have suffered from varying levels of oppression which formulated opinion. I'm going to put some facts out here in this debate which should not be contested. The majority of the world are people of color who have not been vaccinated. Moreover, the majority of liberal countries where these left-wing media is especially prominent and probably most important is people of color. They are people like Brian Tamahi in New Zealand, who is an Indigenous person. Why are they likely to not be vaccinated? It's because they have an underlying distrust in the healthcare system due to experiments in the past that have been done on, for example, African American individuals, or the government oppresses them and they run the healthcare system, so they have distrust in the system. When the left wing come after them and shame them, they don't engage with the underlying reasons why they don't believe in, why they didn't get a vaccination, why that distrust in the healthcare system is valid, something the left wing should probably counter. It's principally wrong to shame people because they have been oppressed in their life and have a fair distrust of the health system. They just shame them and drive these people away further because they feel like there is no one who will back them up, no one who will explain to them why their healthcare system is on their side. Third reason why this is abhorrent principally is for low social SES communities. These people are likely to have low levels of education because schools are underfunded and overcrowded, especially in poor areas where they don't receive a lot of government attention. And college and university is incredibly expensive and out of the pocket of a lot of these individuals. That means their main source of information is Facebook, which makes it, or like TikTok, which makes it incredibly easy to be taken advantage of. This looks like TikTok anti-vaxxers who get shamed, who believe there's microchips in the vaccination because it gets spouted to them through terrible like algorithms that prioritize that material to them. We tell you it's principally wrong for all three levels to be able to shame these people who, have possibly, have very valid reasons. It's principally wrong to shame anyone. But secondly, why negating isn't even able to gain any practical benefits in this debate, and why we're going to further embolden anti-vax sentiment and people on the fence. The first thing to note in this point is these people aren't probably viewing left-wing media unless the anti-vax forum has linked it to them and shared it in an antagonistic way, because they probably don't already engage with all the reasons why you should vaccinate as a left-wing individual. This means that these people are deep in anti-vax communities and they probably act fundamentally irrationally. That means they reject new material that is inconsistent with their previous beliefs. I think that's empirically true because we know that vaccinating is the good thing to do, but these people continue to believe it anyway. It looks like people who lack the scientific literacy to assess the validity of claims that vaccinations are good for you. Maybe they don't trust the authority or the media, which means they're less likely to trust it when it comes from those sources, or they have community ties in anti-vax groups, or they are alienated from their family, so don't have anyone to pass that on. This means that most anti-vaxxers reject the premise that COVID-19 killed this person because it invalidates the premise of their identity. So it means that they use an anti-vax explanation, which spreads quickly because now you're shaming this person, so they have to come up with a counter for that. And anti-vax communities push those more harmful counters. It looks like they died of other conditions. They got secretly vaccinated and that killed them. It looks like it was a freak event or it was a conspiracy theory, which takes people deeper into the anti-vax ideology and trust media and government less. That has flow-on harmful effects when you try to get them to do other things to help the health that aren't part of vaccination because they're less likely to believe you there. But for people who are on the fence or hesitant in this debate, if a person isn't in the vitriolic online arguments, the left-wing response seems really out of proportion and shocking as to why you would shame an individual. It reduces the trust in the media, therefore, because it looks like they have an side and an agenda and they are actively shaming the other side. And if you ever have thought that you agree with that side at any point, you probably don't relate to that media anymore, especially if they are addressing it via a share or link from anti-vax aligned people. Negating is not able to make any change in this debate. They actively push people towards being anti-vax, but beyond that, it is principally abhorrent to shame people who have died of a contagious infection proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the first affirmative speaker for her speech and invite the first negative speaker to continue the debate. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep, loud and clear.
Great, thank you so much. I'm also going to turn my camera as well. Whilst I'm doing that, just like to echo the same trigger warnings that were said by the previous speaker with regards to COVID-19 deaths and the situation regarding that. Okay. All right, last check. Am I visible and audible?
Yep, you are both.
Great, thank you so much. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'd like to start this debate by talking about why we think that the majority of people do not have epistemic access to the right and wrongs of COVID-19. That is because of the fact that if you're an adult without any medical professional, if you're not a medical professional, you're unlikely to know about the actual health benefits, and that there's a significant degree of narratives that say that COVID-19 vaccines actually do harm to you, that it can actually take away from your capacity to work. People, the youth, for example, do not know about the intricacies, precisely because of the fact that COVID-19 does actually have side effects that are incredibly harmful for this specific demographic as well. I think that the biggest impact in this debate that we're going to demonstrate from negative is that we're able to increase the amount of people who get vaccinated and save the amount of lives that are incredibly imperative to this debate. The vast majority of people who do consume left-wing media, but not exclusively, and also swayed by other narratives. The second argument is also going to be about why we're also able to save the anti-vaxxers as well. Rebuttal and I think implicit engagement to what we get from the first affirmative is going to be done. The fact about the principle and the second argument about the emboldening of anti-vax movements are also going to be engaged with my side. So there are two arguments to forward. One, why does this inform the vast majority and increases their chances of getting vaccinated? Secondarily, why does this also sway the anti-vaxxers as well? So the first thing is going to be why this is likely to be, I want to first preface this argument by talking about why it is likely that only exclusively the left wing is going to cover these anti-vax people dying. And I think that this is likely to be an important premise in this debate. The first is by analyzing why the right-wing media does not have an incentive to do so. Actually, this is not contested by first affirmative. They actually agree, because it's seen as hypothetical hypocritical if you oppose your own movements and if you oppose and alienate the very conservative bases that you actually have. And this is the argument that they give in their bullying of points, right? So this proves that the conservative media doesn't have an incentive to cover the deaths of anti-vaxxers, right? But the second, I think, also important thing to note is the moderate media itself, that the moderate media also do not have incentive to cover these campaign people exclusively. And that is for the reason that they're profit-oriented and that they're reliant on the viewership from everyone. That is to say that obviously you're afraid of backlash you get and receive from the conservative community if you cover a specific scenario, right? Because it looks like you're calling out a person specifically if they had died. If this anti-vax person had died and you cover that, that is seen as an attack on the conservative movement, right? And obviously that sees and perceived to be the movement by targeting someone. And therefore, it seems incredibly political, and therefore alienates from the conservative base as well. And therefore, this is a disincentive for the more moderate media to cover this in specific. So what I've illustrated to you there is that the left media has an incredibly big role in portraying that these anti-vaxxers have died in the first place. And therefore, what we prove is that two things. One is that obviously this is a unique source of coverage of anti-vaxxing on the left media, but we also push the burden on affirmative because we say that this coverage is not accessible anyways. So that people have died as a result, the anti-vaxxer campaigners have died specifically, is something that they cannot have on their side insofar as they regret the very coverage of this, and they also counterfactual where they didn't support this either. The second thing I want to talk about is that why is this likely to be covered seriously? And notice that this engages with the analysis that we get from first affirmative as to say why would this likely to be mockery. I simply don't believe this is case. But notice also this implicitly also engaged with the principle, because the principle is contingent on this mockery existing to begin with, that is likely to be portrayed in a way that kind of harms and really de-alienates these people. If it is covered in a dispassionate way or in a way that is very sympathetic, then obviously it doesn't go against the principle, because the principle is basically that you shouldn't dehumanize these people, which we think they're unlikely to do. We think that there are two mechanisms for this. One, they're unlikely to be done because of the fact that this is death is an incredibly significant issue. If someone has died, you're not going to say, ha ha, look at you have died. The fact that it's likely to be covered, even if you don't say condolences explicitly, it's likely to be a very serious issue that these conservative people, the liberal media also take into account. It's a serious thing that affects the vast majority of people, and that person is no longer existing in our world. It's something that obviously these news organizations are likely to understand. But the second thing is obviously the fact that left-wing media positions itself quite politically correctly, right? That there's a significant amount of PC involved. There's oftentimes the case that you do not likely make fun of people dying because of the fact that leftists inherently have a politically correct nature to them, and therefore you're unlikely to make deaths, and therefore this is likely to be bad. But also the second reason, the reason is for that is because the base itself is quite PC as well, and so therefore they're likely to incur significant amount of controversy in this case, in the sense if you portray this in something of a bad way. And the third is because of the fact that there's no necessity to be aggressive for you to even continue and having this news, right? So there's no need for you to be aggressive in order to spread the news that someone has died as a result. And therefore, we think it's quite likely, as a conclusion of all these arguments, all these analysis, is that you're likely to cover this, for example, like this. A prominent figure has died. This anti-vaxxer has died. This person has advocated for things in their life. This person was significantly influential, but they died on this particular date due to COVID-19, and they actually had no record of a vaccination. And they were likely to show, for example, interviews of their families and the families crying, or people who are interviewed, people who are friends with that person, in order to show and impact the vast majority of people who are consuming that media that COVID-19 was a big problem in this area. So the third thing I want to establish is why the focus on anti-vax campaigns uniquely is influential in swaying public opinion towards people getting vaccinated, right? Because you have to understand, in the status quo, as I've also mentioned in my introduction, the vast majority of people are just not sure about the effects of vaccination. If this is uniquely in the context of COVID-19, that's oftentimes the fact that the injection of a foreign substance in you in itself is incredibly viscerally scary for people. You're uncertain in the vast majority of COVID-19 situations because it concerns your very life. And obviously the vaccinations are to some extent have side effects. You might develop a fever, you might have brain fog, for example, and therefore it kind of you're not sure of the capacity for you to work in those situations. And there's also in turn with the other narratives that tell you that vaccines are really good for you because it blocks COVID-19 and therefore likely to save you in the long term, right? So you have to understand that it's not just the sense that many of the people are informed that they can get vaccines. They're oftentimes not sure. And we also want to establish that anti-vaxxers specifically have a significant amount of influence here. First is the fact that they have cults of personalities, that they are able to be very charismatic in the way that they advocate. They're able to be this vaccine is some really, really bad thing, and a controversy that happens. The second is the fact that they're able to also use fear mongering. So the fact that people are scary means that they're able to capitalize on it, and therefore uniquely influential characters in this situation. So what I've demonstrated to you here is that obviously the moderates are also not sure of the narratives. They might sway to the anti-vaxxers. They might err on the side of caution, and therefore people are hesitant to get vaccinated. So why does this coverage that we do in the left-wing media allow for vaccination uniquely? There are four mechanisms I want to go through. One is the fact that they're likely to be informed in the very first place. The fact that you cover this as a general thing that exists, so that someone has died is something that is known by the general public, and therefore this is likely to be incredibly important for these people, and therefore they're likely to be interested. They see that these anti-vaxxers have died, and therefore they read about it on the newspaper, they read about it in Twitter, they search it up and stuff. The second is the fact that this is intuitively urgent, right? That someone has actually died is a significant, important factor that people see viscerally, and therefore they're likely to be influenced by that. That someone, the very fact that someone has died is the reason why you're likely to be incentivized to search. The third is the fact that you oftentimes attribute that because these anti-vaxxers have died, it was clearly the case that because they were unvaccinated, that they had died. So you attribute the reason they had died to anti-vaccine, and uniquely, you create this incentive for you to become vaccinated. So this deals with optics, that people can recognize that death itself was attributed and due to the fact that this person was unvaccinated. The fourth is the fact that you undermine the authority and the authority of the anti-vaxxers. So you know that they were wrong, that they were definitely wrong in the case that they had died. So for that, we are able to establish that these people are likely to be uniquely incentivized to change. How does this affect the moderate majority then, therefore? One is the fact that they're likely to show up for vaccinations. And the fact is because of the fact that they're more informed, they know about the dangers, they know about the deaths, and the anti-vax narrative is undermined significantly as a result. And the second is because of the fact that people realize it's a more urgent issue, that people have died and that the lives are lost, means that they're likely to prioritize it significantly more in their lives. So what we proved to you at the first negative is that the majority of people in society are able to get vaccinated. The impact on human lives is significant and is bigger than all of the principles, bigger than the emboldening of the conservative movement that they've shown. For that reason, please vote negative.
I'd like to thank the first negative speaker for their speech and invite the second affirmative speaker to continue the debate. Here. Am I audible? Second affirmative.
All right, am I audible? And you've
Yep.
got me muted?
Sweet. Audible and visible.
It's unfortunately true that there are people out there that get a great deal of pleasure from the feeling of schadenfreude, which means taking pleasure in unfortunate things happening to other people. I think that is especially true when there is a large base of left-wing readers who are consistently engaged in vitriolic online debates with anti-vaxxers, desperately trying to use facts and logic to convince them that the position is irrational and getting pushed down and just peddled with more and more information. That is the reader base that clicks on articles like the articles we told you about in our characterization. And to the extent that that mechanism and that link is sound, it does not matter if there are also other articles that are in the characterization that Neg wants to talk about, because to the extent that these articles exist and are a necessary part of the trend that we regret, our principle still stands, all of our harm still stands, and their benefits are neutral at best. So I'm going to firstly deal with the characterization, then the principle, and then how do we reduce anti-vax sentiment and convince people to get vaccinated. The first thing to say is the characterization bash we had about whether this is, shocking, cruel, and vitriolic, right? I've already dealt with that in my introduction, but let's deal with it a little bit more, right? They say that death is a significant issue, but I tell you there are clickbait headlines on things that happen that are terrible all of the time, and people are relatively desensitized to this kind of clickbait, especially if it's the kind of clickbait they take pleasure in clicking on. Then they say it's PC type media, but obviously this is an identity politics issue, right? Anti-vax people in the left wing are coded as bad and evil and on the opposite side of the culture war. Therefore, the PC culture doesn't apply to them. It's fine to call them horrible. It's fine to take pleasure in their death because apparently they're evil people. Then they say there's no need for these articles to be aggressive. I've just explained why there's demand for that. People who are engaged in this culture war desire desire articles to be read that are like that. And I think that means there is a vast media incentive to do that kind of reporting because it gets clicked by those people, but it also gets shared by anti-vax people who are engaged in the other side of the culture war. That means you should think in this debate that on the balance of characterization, our characterization is likely to have more articles and their characterization is likely to have less articles. Then they say that only left-wing media will cover. That's fine because we think it's bad and we don't think any media should do it. Okay, in terms of the principle, we show that it is principally abhorrent to use morally wrong means to try to gain the outcome of more COVID vaccinations. We told you that grief is hard and final, that COVID deaths are gruesome, that it twists the knife in the wound for families, and it is not the fault of the families that their loved one has died in this way. I extend here and explain that anyone who's personally affected by COVID is harmed emotionally by the absolute takedown that the media does on these people. It increases their fear of death when they have this really tangible, a thing happening to them. I don't think that's a benefit in this debate insofar as there are other ways to encourage vaccination. You probably shouldn't use a mechanism which is really, really harmful to people's psyche, which makes them frightened, which makes them more upset. I think on our side of the house, we simply do not report on these. We avoid all of the harms. But to the extent we report on abstract numbers, I don't think there's one, direct harm to the families because it's abstracted, but two, I just don't think there is that visceral sense of fear and that happens because it is a bit more abstracted. I think that the first thing to say at their response is that they say it's contingent on the characterization, but it's not totally dependent on the characterization because one, as long as the goal of this reporting is political point scoring or political agenda, even if it does come under the characterization that Neg wants to say, it is still morally wrong to do that because you're using someone's death as a political weapon to try to get a practical outcome in a morally wrong manner. But secondly, I have just shown you that our characterization is more likely, so the principle stands. A second part of our extension that was never touched with is that these victims are not worthy scapegoats, right? These are people who have been systematically lacking access to education, systematically lacking access to scientific literacy. These are people who have been ensnared and captured into anti-vax movements who try to give people reassurance, drag them away from their families. We say that these people are not deserving of being scapegoats. What does this mean? And let's weigh up this debate, because even if they can say that they get more people vaccinated on their side of the house, it is not worth it and it cannot be weighed up against the practical material in this debate. Pain and suffering happens on our side of the house not only, but also humiliation and fear and scaremongering, and all of that is extra, qualitatively to just the lack of deaths that they get on their side of the house. But secondly, as I already explained, if there are other alternative mechanisms to raise vaccination rates, such as government propaganda, such as direct financial incentives, anything else that both teams could stand for, we should use those instead, and they're probably likely to be equally effective as this, because this is pretty marginal, in this debate, right? I think we should not use morally wrong methods to achieve outcomes in this debate. That is something that stands on its own. But there are additional practical impacts to this, right? Because firstly, it pushes the idea that lives are political point scorers, which I think is another moral harm in this debate. And secondly, importantly, listen to this, it pushes retaliatory reporting on vaccine deaths that are caused by having the vaccine. And that's all of the material that flows from Aisha's analysis about why anti-vaxxers rationalize their position with fake statistics and all of this sort of stuff. So I'm sure you've seen the material out there which explains, a lot of that, look at the rates of vaccine people getting COVID versus people who are not getting COVID, but it's fundamentally based on statistical untruths. I think you validate that kind of rhetoric when you do the same thing on the left and they retaliate on the right. What is about the practical impacts in this debate then? One, I said that people don't know about the harms of COVID or the benefits of vaccine. I think they're trying to say this so that they can maximize the harm they get in the debate. But the first thing to say is that many people do just accept the general idea that, COVID is scary and bad and I should protect myself against it. I think people are wary and scared, and they generally have an idea that they do want to get vaccinated. That's why vaccination rates are, 60 or 70% across the world. In countries like New Zealand, it's 90%, right? The second thing to say is that the government is responsible for engaging in correcting that, and that's not necessarily something that we think the left-wing media has done effectively. And I think that even if lots of people don't know about the benefits of vaccines, it just scales up the impacts on either side anyway. The one mechanism here is that they will see someone die in the media and think, I should get the vaccine, right? But that's uncomparative, because I think if somebody is truly hesitant, like normally hesitant and isn't actually snared into anti-vax rhetoric or on the fence in anti-vax rhetoric. I think they're just seeing the statistics, the death. Like if this is somebody who acts irrationally and has the mindset of a rational person, seeing those deaths come up, seeing the fact that people who are vaccinated get far less severe cases of COVID, seeing all of that reporting that would happen in the alternative is probably a better way to make normal people get the vaccine, as well as there's like government campaigns on either side which exist that they can, you know, engage with. There's no contest then with the actual stakeholders we talk about in the debate, which is people who are anti-vax and also people who are on the fence, because not on that second category, they never, like the reporting doesn't engage with people's specific concerns about vaccines, right? Like side effects, distrust in government, or distrust in Western nations who are distributing those vaccines. Therefore, the narrative isn't effective at all on their side of the house, but they're likely to reduce trust in media who report other important COVID info, right? The reason they're likely to do that is because if they have access to that media through other vaccine hesitant friends, then they see that, you know, they just see that somebody has died, but it doesn't actually address their concerns. They're more likely to have accessed that media as evidence that the left wing has an agenda, as evidence that they are against them. I think because people who are anti-vax have strong identity ties, they've been pushed out of their normal family ties, they have a lack of scientific literacy, they have a lack of cognitive dissonance. This is only seen as the left trying to score points in the culture war. It does nothing for them to actually accept vaccinations. I think it only alienates them and turns them away further. That is why we deeply regret this trend.
I'd like to thank the second affirmative speaker for her speech and invite the second negative speaker to continue the debate. Hear, hear.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep, you're both audible and visible.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So the first thing I'm going to deal with is their characterization that this media reporting is likely to be attacking and confrontational. 2 responses. Firstly, I want to engage with their fake reasons. The first thing that they say is that the media is likely to be partisan without any reasons given. That is an assertion. In fact, Ryosuke tells you the fact that they are left-leaning necessarily means they're more likely to be politically correct than ever, because the fact that you're mocking an individual's death means that you're more likely to be cancelled specifically within that community. I'm very sure when Osama bin Laden was assassinated, the left media was the least likely to make fun of him. In fact, they were the most likely to defend this person for the reason that they believe that it was unjust to assassinate this particular individual, for example. Secondly, they said it's likely to be a sensational topic and therefore it is likely to be an attack. Presumably, as Ryosuke pointed out, these are individuals who obviously understand what it means to experience death, for example, because obviously these are people who have their families, who have their friends lost because of COVID-19. It's unlikely that therefore that they're likely to not understand what this feels like. But even if you don't buy the responses that I just gave, there are 2 things to consider additionally. Number 1, their reasons that they give are at best reasons for the media to be left-leaning. They never link it back to why it's likely to be a personal attack. No linkage provided there. But secondarily, even if the assertion and the intuition come from the affirmative is true, and some people like to see people die and make fun of it, like I would argue that those are a particularly niche group of people. So as the most prominent media organization, like CNN, for example, they're unlikely to resort to these types of discourse or these types of narratives in the first instance, because the risk that they have to incur is just too large, because by catering to a small group of individuals, they lose a larger majority of individuals than viewers, for example, that do not like this particular tactic. But secondarily, even if none of this is true, I would argue that the marginal impact that they create out of this is particularly low, because obviously mockery, if their characterization is true, exists at any and all levels of left-leaning media. So obviously they make fun of anti-vaxxers family at normal times as well. The impact of distrust will not change on the both sides of the house. Secondly, let's engage with their principle. The first layer to their principle was family. Number 1, I have 3 responses. Number 1, this is obviously a practical argument that is contingent on personal offense, which we disprove because of my first response. Second of all, even if this is not true and there are personal attacks, it's unclear why family are necessarily affected. For the reason that they're obviously anonymous, you cannot necessarily identify who the family is in the first instance, nor can you attack them for the reasons that you probably do not engage with these individuals anymore, because you are a liberal person who lives in a completely different community from conservatives. I would argue that these are the most, that the families of anti-vaxxers are the most likely to be the ones that do not trust the liberal media in the first instance. So I really don't understand why they view these media in the first instance. They're the least likely
to be affected from these sort of things. But even if this is true, this is not true. I already proved that the mockery is likely to exist on both sides of the house. So there's a marginal increase, just a marginal increase in terms of the damage caused on families in the first instance. And this is quite important, because if it is true that the impact on family is just super marginal or doesn't exist, then I would argue that what remains under the word of the affirmative is mockery on the dead individual at their best. But obviously, this is not important because the dead person is not existent in the first instance. And even if we consider them to be an agent in the first instance, I would argue that they're more likely to deserve these sort of things because they're the individuals who put many and thousands and millions of individuals to death. They probably deserve this. But number three, even if you buy none of these things, I would argue that these are substantially less important impacts from the affirmative because they never show why family matters more than millions and millions of innocent people who are dead because they did not get vaccinated, because of the narrative and rhetorics created by these specific individuals. I would argue that our impacts are just more prevailing and just significantly more important. The second layer that they give is that, well, these are individuals that are likely to be minority and POC. Two responses. Firstly, I would argue that they're just intuitively not anti-vaxxers. They just distrust the government for the reasons of history, for example. They're likely to not be framed by anti-vaxxers in the first instance, specifically because left-wing people, for example, are likely to be highly educated. They know the historical grounds, for example. They are unlikely to therefore make fun of them. That just causes them to be cancelled within this particular community. Second of all, again, this material is fully contingent on personal offense, which we disprove. Again, especially unlikely that these individuals are likely to criticize and create mockery out of minorities, because these are individuals that are most likely to be politically aware in that instance. The last layer that they have to their principle is that, well, these are individuals who did not have education and you should let them go because of that fact. Two responses. First, this is unlikely because these are not average anti-vax people who practice anti-vax, but these are activists. This means they oftentimes fabricate scientific evidence. They oftentimes speak at public forums, for example. These are individuals that are likely to be highly educated and continue to make profit out of fake rhetorics that they create in society, unlikely to be these sort of individuals to begin with. But secondly, this is not a reason for them to allow them to actively commit these types of atrocities, because at best that is a reason for them to have free choice over the use of vaccination, but it is never a reason for them to be allowed to continue to perpetuate rhetorics and information that are just fake, and they know it to be fake. So I would argue that even if they're less educated or not educated at all, this is just not a reason for them to principally defend those sort of individuals. So clearly, the most important impact in this debate is which side prevents COVID-19 via increased vaccination. As provided by Ryosuke, we told you that anti-vaxxers exist on a huge spectrum, and this means obviously we're unlikely to affect the most, firmly believe, the people who firmly believe in anti-vax ideology. This obviously includes people who are moderately anti-vaxxers, especially in the context of COVID-19, where people are unsure about what true information is. In this context, let's engage with the affirmative in the first instance. Number one, they said that the moderates are likely to stay away because they find this to be offensive. Three responses. Firstly, again, premised on what I've already responded to. Secondly, even if this is true, and this is the case that the affirmative says it to be, I would argue that they would stay away more from conservatives than the liberal people. Because if you look at the comparative, obviously the conservatives are more likely to make fun of people's deaths, for example, the fact that liberal people died because they got vaccination, for example. So if it is the case that moderates do not like offenses, I would argue that that's just a reason for them to believe the liberal media more than conservative ones. But number three, I don't really understand what the impact of this necessarily is, because it's just an offense that you create out of this. But what we're propagating on our side of the house is the true impact of not experiencing vaccination in the first instance. I would argue that as a moderate individual who are not being vaccinated yet, they're more likely to prioritize the risk of dying because of not getting vaccinated, as opposed to a minor offense caused on someone else that they do not necessarily know or have any relations to. Secondly, let's look at their comparative, because they have absolutely zero analysis on why statistics is particularly effective. Number one, I would argue that these are ineffective because conservatives are likely to be able to fabricate and build up fake evidence, for example, and no one knows which one is true. But secondly, this will not be widespread, even if you take the affirmative at their best, because these are not intuitive. And obviously, if vast majority of individuals are not scientifically literate, this is all the more the reason as to why this campaign on the affirmative would fail to work. Why then is our comparative much better than theirs? Because Obviously, the moderates who have not been vaccinated yet are not scientifically literate, because if they were, they would have been vaccinated already. These are obviously people who are maximally likely to listen to anti-vaxxers, to read the tabloids, for example. And importantly, these individuals who believe equally in the narratives of anti-vaxxers, because these specific anti-vax activists have a lot of cult of personality. They fearmonger a lot. But this is specifically the narrative that you want to counter these individuals, to sway these individuals back on track, on the right track, on the other side of the house. Why? Because specifically this narrative that targets this particular individual points out that this person was hypocrite. This destroys all of the contingent premises of their credibility that they have relied on for so long historically. And that is the only weapon that we're able to use in this specific instance in relation to this particular group of individuals, to be able to convince them that these anti-vaxxers should not be deserving of a voice within society. And that's why we created a huge marginal change regarding this group. We won this debate on a landslide.
I'd like to thank the second negative for his speech and invite the third affirmative to continue the debate. Hear, hear.
Three points in this speech. Firstly, what does the reporting look like? Secondly, on how this will, on whether or not this sort of reporting changes minds. And finally, on the top level principle material, which takes us the debate in and of itself, even if we lose the other points of clash. Firstly, on what this looks like, we tell you what is empirically true right back at first, that the way that this media is being presented is to undermine the individual, is to own them, is to say you got what was coming to you, you should have been vaccinated, it's your own fault that you've been peddling these messages. We gave you three reasons, which although they pretended they responded to, they actually just counter-asserted over top of. We told you right back at Aisha that this is first of all partisan media, right? It's specifically left-wing. It is done in a way in which to undermine right-wing people. That undermining, it has degrees of scale, right? So maybe the undermining is super aggressive, but even undermining their death in any way is some level of abhorrent. Secondly, it's a heightened and emotional issue. So when people respond to the harms that anti-vaxxer person may have, seemingly perpetrated, they do it in a way which is really, really intense, which does, be quite aggressive, which does undermine their death in a harmful way. But thirdly, the fact that media is just like has sensationalist tendencies, right? The fact that, they operate on clicks, the fact that, they have to appear weird and different and wacky to get people to actually pay and click on the website. All of those reasons point to them sensationalizing this to the extent where it does become harmful and where it's not the pragmatic, nice social stuff they wanted to say that came out. What does OP respond to? They tell us firstly, it's likely to be covered well and seriously because death is significant and sad. But note that that doesn't engage with the reasons we tell you. Even though death is significant and sad, media overcomes that to still choose to report in that way. And the fact that it's significant and sad is the harm that we present in principle. Presumes the people who are doing the media care more about the fact that the death is sad than they do their own agenda. And why is that not true? Firstly, at Bella, we tell you it's an ID poll issue, right? It's vitriolic. But secondly, the same reason that the left-wing media celebrated Trump getting COVID. They laughed at Trump. They said, thanks that you screwed this up, we're going to come and own you. That's the exact same media. CNN, they wanted to say is nice and pragmatic. CNN took great pleasure in owning Trump, just as they take great pleasure in owning all of the anti-vaxxers. But also note that the media isn't just the organized CNN, Vox media that they talk about. This trend has primarily and significantly operated in left-wing media platforms like TikTok, like podcasts, like Reddit threads, where those people don't face the same sort of job regulation or cancellation mechanisms. They're just people who are saying their ideas, and their ideas happen to be really, really mean, to be honest. Those people don't face the same viewer-based regulation, so they can say as much mean stuff as they want. They next tell us that the left wing is PC, so they don't do things that aren't PC. But that's, again, not always true, especially in the circles where this trend has arisen. The first thing to say is righteousness and, feeling righteous over COVID often stands in the way of their wider considerations, maybe about why minorities might have a distrust in the government, which has led to them not taking the vaccine. But secondly, look at left-wing media trends currently. The rise of the dirtbag left in podcasts, which, want the left to be edgy and want the left to, be able to come back against Ben Shapiro and Candace Owens. Those are all the sorts of places that want to say the edgy death stuff. And those are the sorts of things that are gaining prominence, especially amongst young people, against young people. But the last thing to say is, even if you don't believe all of that and you believe the media is perfect and neutral, which is a requirement for you to believe any of their case, we tell you that the discourse around the media is really bad. So even if CNN reports it nicely, the comment section to that Facebook article are disgusting and are vitriolic. The Facebook groups that form, the Reddit threads that form around that media are disgusting and vitriolic. They have to engage with both types of reporting, that fringe reporting and the other sorts of reporting. What do we tell you in comparative though? We tell you firstly that statistics do have a level of effect for some people and convinces them to get vaccinated. But for the people who aren't affected by statistics, it's probably because they're not pragmatic, and they only change their minds when those individual narratives that have stopped them getting the vaccine are actually addressed. Like, for example, listening to Indigenous people's concerns about how the government has experimented on them and not provided them good vaccines in the past. That's a huge issue in New Zealand that gets overlooked when you want to own Indigenous people instead of actually engaging with their real concerns because of that sensationalization. We tell you that their side of the house pushes the discussion to saying you're wrong, look, you're going to die, instead of actually engaging with their real concerns. And that's the disgusting part of this debate. How does it change minds? Opposition says that it feels super urgent, and they feel it viscerally, so they change their mind. But the issue is that it doesn't engage with specificity. In most nations, people know someone who's gotten COVID and felt really sick, or they know someone who's died of COVID just because of the prevalence of COVID. And if that in themselves hasn't changed their mind, it indicates that the anti-vaxxers aren't getting vaccinated for different reasons other than the fact that they might die, or the fact that it's not that they don't think COVID's real, it's because of other reasons that need to be addressed. They secondly say that the attributed reason they have died is anti-vaccination, so people know that it's definitely vaccination. But it doesn't engage with the Aisha, which is that anti-vaxxers will always spin some sort of story. They'll say, oh, it was a government hit, even, to try and discredit that. The third thing they say is it undermines the authority of anti-vaxxers. But how? If anything, it emboldens them. We tell you that right back at Aisha, that normal people think this is a really, really disproportionate response, but anti-vaxxers use narratives to explain why that is really, really bad. It doesn't engage with the cognitive dissonance mech. They link themselves to their own identity. Disproving all of those 3 points that are the only points they have standing about how they change people's minds, what was their engagement on our material? Note firstly how non-vax people engaged. They say that the left-wing media is all liberal, they're well-educated, they're PC, and they're vaccinated. That's what they use to try and justify their characterization of left-wing media. But then that would indicate that the only people they're trying to change the minds of aren't left-wing, because if you're so pragmatic, then all of the left-wing people are vaccinated, which means that the conservatives that see this media don't see it from the left-wing sides. They see it from other sites which are reacting to videos from left-wing media. They see it from other sites which are like Ben Shapiro's owning them. That's how they see it. So they see it through a conservative lens, which already positions them away from that left-wing media. If you're on the fence, the vitriolic response is something that pushes you away, something that makes you feel like the vaccinated group isn't something that you want to be a part of, because they're going to shame you rather than listen to your little concerns. Because those concerns do really, really matter. Things like side effects push people off. Things like a distrust in a government which has systematically discriminated against you. Things things like a distrust in the Western source of vaccines. Pakistan has some of the lowest vaccination rates in the world because of the fact that the US went in there in the early 2000s and distributed a bunch of fake vaccines to try and capture Osama bin Laden. People haven't forgotten about that. And it's not enough to say you should just forget about it and get vaccinated because we're liberal and left wing and it's what's best. You need to address those very, very, very legitimate concerns. It's about we tell you at the end of this point that these sorts of media reporting doesn't actually engage with the reasons that people at this point have not gotten vaccines, and that's something that's bad. Lastly, on principle, it is disgusting at any level and horrific to celebrate deaths. On the minorities stuff in particular, they say minorities are intuitively not vax. That's not a response. And all over the world, African Americans, Indigenous people have some of the lowest vaccination rates. It flies in the face of just what is true. They say, secondly, it's contingent on offense taken by these groups, but it's not even contingent on offense. If you're showing significant examples of bad, African American people in the media, it's not just contingent on how the media is presented, but how people perceive it. People think all African Americans are anti-vax and are bad, and all of those sorts of things. Obviously, there are huge principal harms to that group being scapegoated. Very proud to affirm.
I'd like to thank the third affirmative speaker for her speech and invite the third negative speaker to continue the debate. Here.
Hello, am I visible and audible?
Yep, you are both.
Okay, thank you. So, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Two things in this speech. Firstly, regarding their principled argument, and secondly, about which side can increase vaccinations. So firstly, with regards to the principle, and the first thing I want to note here is that all of their benefits are contingent upon left-wing media portraying this in a mocking and confrontational way. So if we take down this premise, literally not a single argument that comes from the government side can stand within this debate. So what are the mechanisms they had as to why left-wing media is likely to mock this? Firstly, they say that media is increasingly partisan, right? Like firstly, I would argue that left-wing media might be more partisan, but they still rely on moderate left-wing viewers, right? People who are moderate and just casually watch things like CNN, or moderate people who check through their social media and click on things that can link to CNN articles every once in a while and create things like ad revenue for CNN, right? And I would argue that for those people, right, like it's more likely that you're going to alienate these sorts of casual viewers, which, as Tota and Ryosuke established, are likely to make up the majority of your viewer base at the point where you actively mock these people and mock the fact that they are dying, right? Because the majority of people do see death as something that is serious, as something that should not be made fun of. They probably have relatives who were anti-vax and died of things like COVID-19, which is why they're likely to strongly oppose this, right? So you're unlikely to want to take that controversial stance. No response but their side of the house, right? But then secondly, they say that, but secondly, right, even if I said that this was not true and only like the hyper left-wing people watch this left-wing media, right, I would argue that even these people are very sensitive about topics of death, right? For example, taking the Trump vaccination example that they talked about, that was highly controversial, right? Because some people didn't agree with things like making fun of the vaccinations of Trump. They said it was inappropriate. They said it was something that shouldn't be made fun of, right? So even if it's only a left-wing viewer, right, I would argue that to the degree that from a very young age, these people have been internalized with the cultural and religious value that making fun of death is something that is wrong, death is something that is serious. They themselves have relatives, mothers, and uncles that have died who were anti-vaccination and died of things like COVID-19, means that they're likely to criticize this media at the point where they are, at the point where they decide to, make fun of these people, right? And this is quite important because I would argue that if they want to be, sensational and appeal to left-wing people, they can do so in other ways. They can make fun of Trump's hair. They can do things like point out the snowflake, point out like the extreme controversial opinions of the right and make fun of right-wing politicians. They don't have to choose to be sensationalist in this specific way, which is why in this specific issue that is likely to be controversial among its viewer base, it's likely to err on the side of caution and be more moderate as opposed to being mocking and extreme. What are the responses they have to this? Firstly, they say that, but media wants to sensationalize and get things like viewers, right? Firstly, even if media wants to sensationalize, right? If it sensationalizes and gets a lot of clicks, but as a result, a lot of people disagree with them and end up criticizing and refuse to watch their articles in the future, obviously that is counterproductive, right? So even if they want to sensationalize, they will sensationalize in smart ways. But secondly, I would argue that they don't have to sensationalize by mocking, right? They can sensationalize by focusing on how dramatic this story is, focusing on the life story of this particular individual and how they reached to being an anti-vax person. There are millions of other ways to sensationalize the story without mocking them. It's unclear why this specific way was likely to be the one that left-wing media chose, right? But then they say that, but people are desensitized to terrible news, right? But certainly, if this is true, this kills their own case because it means that people won't really be that angry, even if left-wing media mocks these people, right? But secondly, right, I would argue that it is unlikely that they are desensitized because if it's like, for example, the war in Syria, if you're an American, it doesn't really affect you, so sure, you're desensitized to it. But if it's people dying of COVID, it's very proximate. It's something you encounter every day, which is why you're unlikely to be desensitized to it and you're likely to care a lot, right? Then they say, but the comment section is nasty, right? Firstly, if it's just people who hate the anti-vaxxers, hating on anti-vaxxers in the comment section, they probably just do so on ordinary Twitter or they just do so on a regular basis. So I'm not sure why this is exclusive to their side of the house. But secondly, even if this is true, I would argue that then the criticism and the blame is on the commenters and not on the media organization itself. So I still don't think that's a reason why they can take the debate, right? Secondly, they say there are heightened emotions regarding COVID-19 vaccinations, right? Okay, so I would agree that this is true, but it's not just that there are heightened emotions of mocking anti-vax people. There are also heightened emotions that we should respect the deaths of people, even if they are anti-vaccination, for the reason a lot of people do have anti-vax relatives and uncles, and they have faced and suffered through the deaths of them, right? So it goes both ways. It's still a controversial issue, which is why left-wing media is likely to err on the side of caution. All of this analysis proves that it's unlikely that it's likely to be mocking, and therefore debunks all of the case coming from the opposition side, right? But they're not going to be generous and engage a bit more in detail. So I think the strongest push they had was that, but people who are indigenous and POC, right, you make fun of them. I would argue that, okay, let's say that this is true. Which is more important, right? Making sure that these people get vaccinated and don't die of things like COVID-19, or making sure that at least the majority of the population is vaccinated, and therefore, they're less likely to spread COVID-19 to POC communities, or making sure that these people's feelings aren't hurt. I would argue that even from a POC right perspective, you're more likely to care about not dying. You're more likely to care that your daughter doesn't die of COVID-19 because her schoolmates and classmates in school have COVID-19 and are unvaccinated, more than you care about the short-term cost of having your feeling hurt because left-wing media is mocking you. So even taking them on that metric, I would argue that we benefit POC people more. But even taking their best case scenario where we hurt the families of activists, for example, again, as Tota said, and they failed to respond to, it has to be weighed against the harm of millions of people losing their lives and losing their loved ones and losing their families on their side of the house. They have to prove why that trade-off is justified in the first place, right? So I would argue that on our side of the house, at the point where we support and save more families from being hurt on our side of the house, we're able to take over this principle claim. Then secondly, right, why are we able to increase vaccinations on their side of the house? So firstly, I want to deal with their point about anti-vaxxers, right? And they keep strawmanning us and saying that you can't change anti-vaxxers, but no, that's never the demographic we're talking about in the first place. We are talking about moderates, right? Firstly, they say that anti-vaxxers won't change. That's fine. We want to change the majority of people, for example, young people, uncles, grandfathers, who are confused because they have information from both sides. One saying that taking the vaccine is good for you or prevent COVID-19. The other side saying that, but these vaccines, their production was rushed. They're not properly clinically tested yet. These people are confused. And if we push these people towards actually getting vaccinated, that's fine. We don't have to change the anti-vaxxers, right? But secondly, they say that anti-vaxxers will use this to spread anti-vaccine narratives to moderates, right? Firstly, this is not mutually exclusive. I would argue that this is not mutually exclusive. Firstly, they have the incentive to do so on either side of the house because still anti-vaxxers hate left-wing media, which criticize their ideology. But secondly, they have the capacity to do so on either side of the house, right? Because even if left-wing media doesn't mock the deaths of anti-vaccine activists, right? They can still do things like, for example, take the words of left-wing media out of context or take the most extreme views that they have and do things like edit that and make it sound like left-wing media is just just very crazy and very uncredible in general. It's unclear why this specifically was a useful way for anti-vaxxers to spread their influence, which is why this makes no sense in the debate, right? This is important because I think all their responses to us are things like, but people have confirmation bias, so they won't believe it, even if you tell them that this anti-vaxxer has died, or that people have things like cognitive dissonance, so they're unlikely to listen to them. But at the point where we're not talking about anti-vaxxers in the first place, like moderates don't have that confirmation bias, they're just confused people. They don't inherently believe that anti-vax is the right way to go. It means that all their rebuttals to us are just a misrepresentation and tackling a different actor than the one that we were talking about in the first place, which is why all their points fall, right? But then let's talk about moderates, right? Firstly, they assert that people are vaccinated. Unclear why this is true. I think Ryosuke gives several analyses. We told you about how people are confused. There's too much information on both sides of the house, how taking a vaccine shot and getting unknown foreign fluids put in your body is extremely scary compared to the speculative benefits that you might get better because of COVID-19. But secondly, I would argue they just assert and they don't have any mechanism about why the alternative they support, statistics, is actually useful or actually effective on their side of the house. We gave you several mechanisms about why this was a uniquely effective method. And for mechanism, we told you firstly that these people have cult of personality, so people are uniquely interested as opposed to statistics, which are dry. Secondly, we told you that this shows this as an urgent issue, that you could die of COVID tomorrow, so you have to get the vaccine as soon as you can. Thirdly, we told this that this actively allocates the fault of dying to anti-vaccination, which uniquely undermines it. And lastly, we told you that undermines the authority of anti-vaccination activists, which uniquely weakens their power. And for those reasons, we comprehensively take this.
Okay, I'd like to thank the third negative speaker for her speech and invite the negative reply speaker to close the negative half of the debate. Just a reminder, for reply speaker timing, I'm going to be clapping once at 3 minutes, twice at 4 minutes, and then 3 times at 4 minutes 15.
Audible?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Okay. All right, starting my speech in 3, 2. We're going to look at 3 questions in this speech. First is, what does the reporting look like? Because this affirmative team claims that this is likely to be defamation. The first thing that they say is to assert that this is empirically true, but we said that CNN does not do it. I don't know what world they come from in the first instance, let alone the fact that this is assertive. And then they give 2 reasons. First, they said media is partisan. Second, they said they're likely to create sensation. We told you in the first instance, these are not reasons for why the liberal media are likely to resort to things like defamation. At best, this is a reason for things like, mockery or, characterizing them not in a positive light, for example. But furthermore, we actually disproved both of those reasons, because we told you that the fact that they are partisan necessarily means that they care about political correctness, for example. Or we also told you that it is unlikely that these specific types of media have an incentive to sensationalize death in specific, because that has higher cost to viewers, viewership of these media than the marginal amount of viewers that they increase under their side of house, because some people like deaths and making fun out of this. This means that the negative claim that people care about death and political correctness in this specific community obviously trumps their analysis in this instance, and their counter assertion that the liberal media talked about Trump in a negative light is obviously not a sufficient response. Specifically because Trump did not die, and that's just doesn't apply to analysis, even if you take them at their best. So the only real analysis that remains in this question from the affirmative is that you still have fringe media. That is it. But by definition, those are fringe, and they did not do any weighing as to why fringe media is an important actor in this debate. That is why the affirmative's claims do not make sense in this debate in the first place. But second question, is this principally unjust? I just want to note firstly that this is the affirmative's only standing argument in this debate, because obviously other claims that they make are mitigatory to our argument. By the way, I want to first clarify that they conveniently frame this to be a principal argument, but this is not really a principal argument, because there's no weighing that they do as to why this is specifically unjust, because we told you that it is equally unjust to let people die because of the narratives that the anti-vaxxers create. Obviously, there needs to be some weighing done, and we do the weighing here, and that's why we win, even if you consider this to be an argument. Their first claim was family. We told you firstly that it will likely not target family, and secondly, we told you that they are likely to be immune. Their second claim was minorities. Firstly, we said these are people who are unlikely to be framed as anti-vax activists in the first instance, specifically by the left. But secondly, we told you that this is it's unclear why minorities are likely to be the majority of case in which this debate takes place, for the reason that they are minorities, for the reason that they portray no incentive as to why American media would portray an anti-vaxxer in Pakistan, let alone the fact why the left wing has an incentive to cancel those individuals in that specific context. The last claim that they make is that, well, these individuals are uneducated. Firstly, we told you that that is false. Secondly, we told you that this is not a good defense to let this happen. But on top of that, we told you that all of these are symmetric because liberal media, if their characterization is true, have an incentive to make fun of these individuals regardless of deaths that is specific to this debate. But even if you believe none of that, this is pretty low impact, and our impact easily outweighs all of their impacts because this is not really a principal argument. So the last question in this debate is, does this increase vaccination, especially regarding the people on the fence? The negative claim, our claim, is that this undermines the influence of anti-vaxxers and therefore relatively increases vaccination rates. The affirmative's biggest challenge to this is that this will not change anything because the rhetorics of urgency, for example, does not matter to people who are scientifically illiterate. But this is a misrep of our case because the status quo that they perceive of in this debate is a misconception in the first instance, because the status quo that we portray to you from our side of the house is that they don't know which side is true, let alone even though they listen to CNN and anti-vaxxers, because both of them have equally persuasive narratives in the status quo. What we do is take one away and destroy the premise of credibility of one specific actor. What remains on the other side of the house is the other source of media that people listen to, that is CNN. That is why we are more likely to relatively increase the persuasiveness of liberal media that are more likely to be legitimate, and that is the mechanism by which we increase vaccination. All of the claims from the affirmative are either mitigatory or not proven. They don't prove why the comparative is good, and that's why we clearly take this debate.
I'd like to thank the negative reply speaker for his speech and invite the affirmative reply speaker to close the debate. Hear, hear.
Sweet. Am I audible and visible?
Yep, you are both.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The first thing I'm going to do is engage with the characterization in this debate and which is likely. I'm going to note here that if you believe that we win the characterization clash, we win this debate alone because they refuse to engage with what a world would look like where this characterization is true and instead just try to rebut it where we engage with both. So even if we lose the characterization clash, we can win the next 2 points of clash. Firstly, on the principle, and secondly, on whose minds you're changing. Firstly, on the characterization. And I think we explain this to you down the line and they still refuse to engage with it, which is that they say some counter incentives on left-wing media as to why they won't vilify these people. For example, left-wing people are PC, or they've had other members of their family who have died, but they don't weigh why that is a more important incentive on media companies or then the reasons we give you. We give you a deadlock breaker to this at Harper to no response in neg block, which is that profit and the agenda is more important to these people. It's more important to their shareholders. It's more important to the viewers who believe that they are part of the culture war. And that's why they're likely to vilify these people, which means the majority of this media coverage is the characterization we give you. And we win this debate because they refuse to engage with what that looks like for people in changing their minds, or in terms of the principle, when this characterization applies, they're likely to do it for clicks and money. But even if they win this characterization clash, they never engage with all the analysis down the line as to why it's likely that some sections of it do it. Some sections who being PC doesn't apply to them, for example, the dirtbag left, which means that even if we cop a large amount of harm that never gets responded to on our characterization, because judges believe that at least some portion of media is doing this, probably most likely to be the majority. Think if we win this characterization clash, back to Tota's second neg speech, where every single response was, we've already disproved this with the characterization. I think that proves alone we're quite a bit ahead here. Then I tell you about the principle, because their biggest push here is contingent on characterization. This is just untrue. We give you 2 other reasons reasons why this principle is abhorrent. Firstly, using someone's death as a political football in a culture war is a terrible way to engage with the actual death of a living person, with the fear that unvaccinated people have that they might die of COVID-19, that the fear that vaccinated people have that their friends and family will die of this abhorrent disease. But secondly, describing a death and putting them at fault for their own death is abhorrent in it itself. And I give you an example at first affirmative that you wouldn't blame someone for their own suicide. It seems unfair to blame someone who is unvaccinated for their own death on COVID-19. Again, we're able to win on this clash alone. And we widen this margin if the characterization is true because of all the extra harms we accrue if this death is vilified. It's more vitriolic than just, but it's already vitriolic instead. And we note that we must have won a proportion of the characterization clash. So this is a huge harm to these people, principally. Even if the characterization is false, though, they don't engage with the comments that occur on these posts. The comments that get accepted in public because there is more reporting on how this person's death was their own fault, which means that they vilify people. And note they extra vilify minorities and low SES communities. We give you examples of that doesn't get engaged with. Instead, the negating team asserts that they would never do it to minorities, and it refuses to give you structural analysis on why that's true. Lastly, then, because I want to widen the margin even more and make this a clear decision for you judges, I know that's always nice, is that we tell you that we're going to not change people's mind. And that is because unresponded analysis that we give you down the line of how anti-vaxxers and moderates who are on the fence are likely to access left-wing media, which is that they don't read left-wing media, and they're likely to get their news through Facebook or TikTok, which means they get it through anti-vax forums or people already shitting on it in the echo chambers they are in, which means they're already predisposed to not having their mind changed by left-wing media insulting anti-vax, maybe heroes to them, maybe just people who they believe have a valid opinion. We tell you that that's both moderate and anti-vaxxers, and the fact they never engage with that analysis is damning to their case, because it means they can never accrue any benefits because they never give you any substantive of how else you are going to engage with this media if you are moderate or anti-vax on every single clash. We win this debate by a massive margin. Proud to have a fun debate.
Okay, I'd like to thank the affirmative reply